Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Matt Babcock with me. Matt is an NBA draft analyst, an NBA media member. And one of the things I think you're going to hear in his journey is how sometimes you have to be willing to take a leap of faith into the unknown to get to where you want to go. So, Matt, thanks so much for being on today.
Oh, hey, Phil, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
You bet. So, to start your story, basketball has been an important part of your family for a very long time. So, talk a little bit about growing up with your dad at the Milwaukee Bucks and yeah, first memories of basketball and just falling in love with the game.
No, sure, yeah. I mean, I was, like I said, it's been around my life, my entire life. My dad, my two uncles have all worked in basketball since before I was born. My oldest uncle, Pete, started working in the NBA in the late 70s. So I was born in the mid 80s. So he was pretty well established by the time I was even born. And my middle uncle Rob followed in his footsteps. Front office, member of the NBA for a long time. And my dad was a college coach for 15 years before he got into the NBA. So I really grew up, as a coach's son first, and sort of had, sort of an angle into the NBA through my uncles, sort of like a peripheral view, if you will. And then my dad got in the NBA when I was in middle school, and so from there, it really kind of got a front row seat to see all the behind the scenes of the NBA. And yeah, just as far as first memories, I couldn't tell you, but it was probably in a locker room or a gym somewhere with my dad as a coach.
Now, as you look at that, I always think it's an interesting dynamic when, kids grow up and they have parents in a sporting realm or have achieved at a high level. And sometimes they say, like, Pistol Pete, my dad just was, forcing me to play the sport. And then you get other times where parents go, I wasn't going to force them to do it. If they fell in love with it, great. Talk a little bit about that for you with your dad. Obviously basketball is something he was passionate about and loved. Was there any, nudging for Matt, or was it just kind of, hey, whatever you want to do, I'll support you?
Yeah, no, my dad didn't put a whole lot of pressure on me. I mean, I think at a certain point where I committed to becoming a basketball player myself. I mean, there's, little things of like, hey, stop playing video games, get some shots up, that kind of thing. And did you do your ball handling, drills today? And but yeah, nothing over the top. And it really for me, and I've actually had a lot of friends too that have had similar backgrounds, dads being former players or coaches or general managers. And one thing that a lot of us have shared is sort of the pressure kind of being built within, and so like, trying to fill in, big shoes with my uncles and my dad. So the pressure came from me internally. I mean, I've always put a lot of pressure on myself. Over time, I've learned to, kind of take it easy on myself a little bit. But like when I was in high school, I mean, the pressure was from me.
Now, speaking of high school, as you're playing, you end up deciding, hey, I want to progress and want to go play collegiately. And so your path, you start at a junior college and are playing there, and then end up transferring to Arizona. So talk a little bit about the path for you and why you went the junior college route first, and then ultimately ended up with the Wildcats.
Yeah, so I spent my first 3 years in high school in Milwaukee. Long story short, I butted heads with my coach and needed to make a change. My uncle Pete was general manager of the Atlanta Hawks at the time, and he said they had a really good school in his neighborhood, good coach, and the head coach was Lon Kruger, and his son was my age, Kevin, who's now the head coach at UNLV. And so my senior year, I had moved to Atlanta to live with my aunt and uncle, and played with Kevin at Walton High School. And we had a great year, and I was getting recruited by some D1s, had some decent offers. And like most kids, I probably thought I was better than I actually was. And so I decided, I needed a full year to get recruited properly. And back then, the prep school scene wasn't quite what it is now. I mean, I was considering going to like a Maine Central Institute was the one prep school I was looking at. Very, very isolated in the middle of nowhere, Maine. And I had some really high level junior colleges back then. Junior college was a much better option than it is now. It was very competitive.
Yeah.
So my options were going to Maine and live in the middle of nowhere, freezing town, or go live in Panama City Beach, Florida. And easy decision for me. So I went to Florida, played one game, did really well, and got hurt. I got a medical redshirt my freshman year, and decided, what, I just this is a rough go. What if I walked on for a year, would schools be interested in, higher level schools be interested in taking me on? And I had a lot of schools, make me that offer to, walk on for a year, scholarship me the remaining. And so I was all set to go to the University of Georgia to play for Jim Herrick. And I mean, I think I had like 6 months where I was verbally committed to them, and they all got fired. So I was kind of back to the drawing board. I visited Auburn,
Yeah.
played against their guys. They wanted to do the same deal, but they all got fired. It was Cliff Ellis was the coach at the time, so I decided to go back to the JUCO for a second year, and kind of just same idea of play my way into bigger offers. Same knee injury again, missed another year. So then. Open it up to walk on just outright. And Lute Olson wanted me to come on, be a part of the team. And I grew up in Arizona, loving Lute Olson, and knew I wanted to work in basketball, and jumped at the opportunity. And it really wasn't fruitful from a playing standpoint, but the experience of going and being a part of a program like that, and being around Lute and his staff, really kind of led me into working in sports. So that's my long story that is long.
I love it. Now, I'm always curious, there's certain college coaches that have had, tremendous success and, success leaves clues. What were maybe one or two things that you learned, playing during, for Coach Olson that, really stuck out to you of, hey, I'm going to tuck this and there might be a future day in my, career that I'm going to reuse this.
I don't have any specific quotes. It was more of just like how he handled himself and how he handled the community. He had so much presence, and he was very professional. I think he picked and chose his words, very wisely, and I think because of those reasons he was just respected so much by everybody. I mean, just a classic guy, just the way he dressed and the way he spoke to people and handled them, and then little stuff too of like how he ran his program, ran practice. He was very organized. I wouldn't say he was necessarily, the greatest basketball mind ever been around, especially if we're talking about, a Hall of Fame coach.
Yeah.
But he was just so smooth and sharp, and I think it really allowed him to operate at such a high level. I mean, he was a terrific recruiter. I mean, really built, Arizona into a program that's just, I mean, to this day is still a powerhouse, and it wasn't before he got there.
Yeah. I love it. Now, to your point, you said, hey, as I, was playing at Arizona, I realized that, playing in the NBA as a player was not probably going to be the route for me, but I'm intrigued on potentially, the agency side and things. And so you end up getting your first job with Wasserman. So talk a little bit about, that first job and the excitement that came with it.
Yeah, I mean, growing up as obsessed basketball kid, and having a family that worked in basketball as coaches, scouts, general managers, I had known I wanted to work in basketball, since I can remember. I mean, at the moment I remembered, wanting to be an NBA player, I still had the plans of being a coach or scout or general manager, and so that was always in the plans for me. And so when I was at Arizona, I got into player development. I was working out kids, even while I was a walk-on there. And so the first job with Wasserman Media Group was not with an intention to become an agent. It was a summer internship, but so I did some stuff in the office, but my main priorities were being on the court, training their draft prospects. We had 7 first-round picks, so I was Dave Yeager's assistant, coach essentially. Dave, went on to be NBA head coach on multiple teams. At the time, he was just a minor league coach, and yeah, we had like 2 months where every single day we're working with Brandon Roy and JJ Redick, and it was really just an awesome experience, and really led me to my first full-time job as a player development coach for Virtus Bologna, a EuroLeague team in Italy, and I really thought I was on the path to coach, and yeah, that was sort of an interesting first couple of years for sure.
Now, one thing that I think is interesting, we're going to continue to hear this in your journey, but is taking the leap into where you want to be going. And I think for you, Matt, you had a, North Star. You had a direction in which you wanted to be moving. And so when you saw opportunities that could move you closer to that goal, you would take advantage of it. But I think self-admittedly, over time, you said I maybe jumped, too soon a couple of different times in my career. So talk a little bit about, you know, I'll maybe phrase it this way: listening to what you think is best and listening to the people in your circle that their opinion of what they think is best and how to decipher between the two.
Yeah, I mean that's honestly a tough question to ask. A few thoughts come to mind. For one, I mean, growing up in basketball, coach's son, and then an NBA, NBA kid, we moved a lot,
Yeah.
and I think I become sort of immune to change, and almost to a point where I expected it and almost needed it, subconsciously. So then early on in my career, I think. One, in hindsight, I probably was a little bit screwed up because of it. And then two, having come from at that point, a lot of exposure to the NBA, and then being at a high level program like Arizona, and then my first job being at Wasserman Media Group, which is the biggest sports agency in sports at the time.
Yeah.
Everything it was the glitz and the glam, and so I think being a young kid that was extremely confident, right or wrong, and ambitious. My expectations were all over the place, and so I think the combination of all those things and just sort of being so used and the need for change, I was impatient and I jumped around a lot, and it in one way, I regret some of those moves. I should have had more stability and more stick-to-itiveness, but it did allow me to gain a lot of valuable experience. I mean, learning from my mistakes for one, but then also seeing how a lot of other people operate, good and bad. And so I've become very well-rounded because I've had well-rounded experience. And so, I mean, I think it, depends on how you look at it. But, at this point in my life and career, I'm choosing to look at it glass half full. But, I wouldn't suggest to younger people to bounce around quite as much as I did.
No. Now, going back to a couple of things you mentioned, one was getting to train and work out guys like Brandon Roy, JJ Redick, as they're preparing for the NBA draft combine. I think so many stories circulate about certain players and the work ethic. And I think you see with longevity of certain people, like, yeah, that story is real. So, as you started to work out some of these, NBA draft prospects, were there certain things that really stood out where you're like, you know what? There's something about this guy, and it's not just, his ability to make a three-pointer. It's, this dedication that really stands out as you're going to have a great opportunity to have a career in the NBA.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I would have different opinions on every single guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think during that time, I mean, Brandon Roy, I mean, he really was so impressive. I mean, I was not surprised at all that he stepped in and became a star right
Yeah.
off the bat. I mean, he was a Pac-12, Pac-10 guy back then. I'm aging myself here.
Yeah.
But so I was very familiar with him, but being able to work with him every day for a month or two. I mean, it was so clear just like how talented he was. I mean, his size, his physicality, his burst, and keep in mind, I mean, I was at Arizona with some like really high level players. My workout partner was Salim Stoudemire, who was
Yeah.
All American, 30th pick in the draft, and I play one on one against him almost every single day, and B. Roy was just on another level. It was really sad to see his career come short with those knee problems. But yeah, when he was in his prime, I mean, he was as good as it gets. And then yeah, with JJ, I was a shooter as a player, and so it was really neat to have that up close view with JJ. And I mentioned Salim Stoudemire was my workout partner, and those two were the best shooters in college back then. Two of the best shooters I've ever seen, and yeah, it was really fun working with JJ, and I'm not surprised at all to see him, be so successful. Just a very smart guy. I mean, I think everything he did as a shooter, which I think is necessary for shooters in general, he was very deliberate. Everything was for a reason. He was very thoughtful in everything he did as far as approaching, every workout. And he's just so damn competitive, and I think, the confidence, the competitiveness, and then just, being sharp and deliberate with everything he does. Those are the two things that two guys and the things about them that really stood out to me during that window.
I love it. Now, as you mentioned, you decided to move overseas to take a coaching job, and being overseas is just different, right? It's a different culture, it's a different environment. You've left everything you've really known, and you're overseas, and all of a sudden you get a phone call about an opportunity, and you book a flight back. So, talk a little bit about the phone call and deciding to come back to America.
Yeah, well, a few things. So I, mean, I got the initially from Wasserman Media Group, I had an offer to go have the same position with a team in Istanbul, Turkey, and I was all set to go there. And then an agent that was sort of mentoring me at the time said, "Hey, you're not going to Turkey. You're going with my team in Italy." And I'm like, "All right, well, that sounds pretty good." So I kind of hopped on a plane to Bologna, Italy, without much information.
Yeah.
Just knowing that I was going to go be an assistant coach. I was 23 years old, going to be assistant coach of one of the best teams in Europe. Most of the players were, 10 years older than me with families and whatnot. So I went there and it was a really unique deal. They didn't pay me a cent, but I got the red carpet. I mean, they gave me, a team car. I got to eat at the team restaurant 3 meals a day, whatever I wanted, just right off on the team. All expenses covered. They put me in a sweet condo or apartment that was in the same building as the team owner. And Bologna is just a great city. It's a college town, so it's very it's great for me. It was very social, a lot of younger people around. Best food in Italy, which is probably the best country for food in the world.
Yeah.
So life was good. And then what had happened was I really enjoyed my time there and the people I was working with. But the job was a little loose. I mean, I wasn't even getting paid. And before I got there, I didn't realize I needed to get a coaching license. So they're wanting me to sign a 2-year deal, get a coaching license, and make a pretty big commitment. And so it felt kind of clunky. I wasn't traveling with the team at first. And I was just this young guy living in Europe by myself. I didn't speak Italian. I got a little homesick. And then I got an opportunity with Excel Sports Management to be a junior sports agent for them. And at that point, in time, I was really, um, like a lot of young people, especially in sports. I mean, I was so ambitious. I really wanted to kind of conquer the world overnight. And I was just, I was open-minded, as far as what my angle into basketball was. But I knew I wanted to blaze my own trail in basketball and do big things. And like I said, I wanted to conquer the world overnight, which wasn't realistic. And so I jumped at a good opportunity, moved back to LA, and that's when my journey as being a sports agent began.
Yeah. So the industry of sports agency, I think, always appears attractive from the outside, right? Hey, you just get to go hang out with, these top NBA or NFL, MLB players, but there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, it's, having a relationship with them, maintaining the relationship, representing them, finding them opportunities, right? So talk a little bit about some of those early years of just learning the world of sports agency. And once again, you were learning from one of the best in the industry at the time. And so just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, those first few years in the agency business, that's when I bounced around the most. I worked for several different agencies. I mean, it was pretty much like a new agency every year. It's funny in hindsight, it all felt sort of easy. I had so many job opportunities, and I think a lot of it was because of my family and I was so well connected. And it wasn't as much of just like, nepotism or, anybody doing favors. There's not favors in the agency business. It's all about generating business. And so they
Yeah,
saw
right.
me as, and I'm just, assuming here, but I think I was looked at as somebody that could open up doors because of my last name. And, um, it created a lot of dysfunction for me because, like I said, my expectations were all over the place. I had come from the basketball world, and so everything, was about development and doing things the right way. And the agency business is cutthroat. And so, I mean, for example, like with Excel Sports Management, I didn't feel like those guys are classy guys. I like them, but I mean, I still got sort of a window of how competitive the recruiting was, even though I wasn't doing really any of the recruiting. Um, it's just I remember those first couple years. In the second year, I was with Andy Miller, who
Yeah.
got in a lot of trouble for his recruiting tactics. And it was just very eye-opening. And I think, it was one of those things where I did commit to wanting to succeed as an agent, and I kept, struggling to find my spot to where I felt comfortable. And the big companies I had a hard time with early on because I felt like they were big machines. They didn't, care about their players. This is all like general statements, obviously not
Yeah.
directed at any one agent or anything. And so then I went, smaller and smaller, more boutique because I felt like it kind of fit my sort of my moral compass a little bit better, a little bit more of a personal touch, kind of your cliche Jerry Maguire
Yeah.
type approach.
Yeah.
And then that could create a whole other set of issues too of being an independent agent and just, how competitive is, David versus Goliath, competing against
Right.
these big agencies. And so I kind of tackled the agency business from every angle you could possibly imagine. And and I had some success, but it just over time it really burned me out and I missed being a true basketball person. I mean, I still looked in the mirror and be like, I'm Matt Babcock, basketball guy. And over time, I started feeling like everybody else was looking at me as Matt Babcock, the agent, and it just
Yeah.
didn't feel right, And so I did it for 10 years. Ultimately had my own company and represented a ton of different guys, NBA players, and then like a ton of guys overseas. Yeah, it was really a wild journey, and I wrote a series of stories on Babcock Hoops like on my site. My past life as a sports agent, and it's funny. It feels like when I talk about this or when I wrote those stories, I feel like I'm talking about somebody else.
Now, to get into that, I know
Yep.
you mentioned, hey, I was at a few different firms. If I recall correctly, the first player that you brought on was Jody Meeks. And, I think once again, whenever there's a great talent, right, it's not as if Matt's the one going and finding the, unheard of player. It's like, no, Jody Meeks had a great career in the SEC. But talk a little bit about how the relationship came to be where you were going to be able to represent him.
Yeah, so what had happened was, so I had those first few years where it was, I mean, I was just bouncing around like crazy. I mean, I was all over the place and worked for the big agencies. And I went with a really small agency, and it was probably a little too small. And then I linked up with a guy named David Baum, and he was Andrew Bogut's agent. So I got to know him because of Andrew and the connection with the Milwaukee Bucks. And David was a longtime agent under David Falk, who's one of the best agents of all time, Michael Jordan. I mean, every superstar in the 80s
Yeah.
and 90s essentially. And he had just broken off to create his own company, DB Hoops, and needed a young right-hand man, and so it was perfect for me. It was a guy that was operating at a high level. He had like 10 NBA players, Ron Artest, Bogut, Stojakovic, but he was kind of a one-man show at the time, and gave me an opportunity to be his right-hand man, and gave me, it was my first time really having a lot of responsibilities, doing a lot of the representation work and recruiting. And so the first, I think I signed on with David that spring, and Jody Meeks had entered the draft out of Kentucky, and his dad was handling his pre-draft, and they're kind of moving really slow on the agent selection process. And so I got wind of that and reached out to the dad, did a hard sales pitch. It went well, connected with David, did a meeting, boom, we signed him. And it was pretty crazy because my first signing was a really great player. I mean, I think Jody played in the league, what, 10, 11, 12 years or something like that. It was an early second round pick. And it was really a clean recruitment. It was a last minute. It was really straight up. It wasn't your typical, bribery type situation. And
Yeah.
yeah, it really kind of gave me hope of like, you know what, maybe, a setup like this where it's people that are really, put together and experienced and doing things the right way. Maybe we do have a shot of competing at a high level, and it doesn't have to be, the cliche under the table, slimy business. And yeah, so that was an interesting, first player to sign because that wasn't typical.
No. Now, within that, and I'm sure it varies from every athlete, but, I'm sure there are certain families that they want to keep it close to the chest. There's others where maybe you're more dealing with a coach, who has had more of the experience than the family does. And they say, well, we trust the coach, deal with them. As you were kind of navigating those relationships, how did you go about that in the process of making connections? And then, really, once again, at the end of the day, it's a relationship game, and relationships are critical to get your foot in the door. And then from there, yeah, there's different practices of how you actually bring them on, but you'd have to get your foot in the door. So, talk a little bit about growing relationships, and then how that helped you, really get connected with different players.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that was, initially my biggest strength of just, growing up in my family. And it wasn't just, inheriting my family's connections is that, I was so passionate about basketball always, and my family was always great about it, and allowing me to be around. And I mean, I was always at the pre-draft workouts, and I traveled with the team some, and I volunteered at the NBA draft combine several years. And so I was always very assertive as far as knowing that I needed to be around people to learn and be a sponge, but then
Yeah.
also I needed to network. And so that concept really stuck with me early on. I'm really thankful I was able to identify those things as being so valuable, because it's really benefited me my whole career, of taking that approach of not just leaning on my family's connections, but like using that initial black book and building on it. And so I've always been very very assertive with networking, and doing what I can to help people, and knowing that it all comes around one way or another in this business, especially in sports, but I mean, really in all industries.
I love it. Now, a next player that you were able to cultivate a relationship with, but is a fun story, is the Samardo Samuel story. So, talk a little bit about how that relationship kind of blossomed, and then really how his draft stock blossomed as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, similar to what you said, he had a guy that was sort of, mentoring him. It was the head of the Jamaican basketball, the national team. And same idea. I got connected with him, and sold him on what we got going on, and kind of, sort of explain, like, hey, I'm assuming, you've got the big agency saying this, you got the small agency saying this. We're right in the middle. We're a boutique agency, but we've got some high power going on. And then that was gonna be me and David. Outlined David's background, and very similar to Jody. I mean, we kind of got him last minute. He was an underclassman, and he was the number one player out of high school, and he did pretty well at Louisville. I think he probably didn't quite live up to expectations. And so what we had said was, okay, enter your name in the draft. I think you keep the door open of returning, but let's go through the initial process. If you want to stay in, we want to represent you. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And push came to shove. He's like, you know what? I'm done with college. I want to be a pro. And he did, and it was great. David, so the deal was with the guys that David already had, with like Artest and Stojakovic and Bogut. I was involved with them, but more on the back end of just kind of helping David strategically, whether it be like free agency stuff, trades, and then I handled a lot of their marketing.
Yeah.
But with the players that I sort of spearheaded the recruitment on, David was the primary agent, but I handled a lot of the day-to-day work. And so with Jody, we got him later, so a lot of the work had already been done, and then David stepped in and negotiated the contract. With Samardo, we got him from the start, and so I mean, I pretty much spearheaded all of the pre-draft, and so I was the one initiating most of the calls with teams, managing the schedule, getting the feedback, really kind of organizing things. And I mean, we ended up scheduling him 18 workouts that pre-draft, which was the most I ever scheduled. I think the window was larger than it is now. The NBA has kind of tightened it up.
Yeah.
And He did all of them but one, and he did a great job. And yeah, we thought he would be a solid second round pick. He even had one team that told him he thought he'd be a first round pick. Um, yeah, we didn't believe it, but it kind of created some stress for us. Anyway, he went undrafted, and the night of the draft was pretty crazy because back then there wasn't two ways or exhibit 10s. You're pretty
Yeah.
much just securing summer league spots,
Right.
and it typically happened that night or the next day. I mean, the spots would fill up really quickly, and so we had a lot of interest in Samardo from teams, and the Lakers being one of them, who had the 59th pick. And we had a really great relationship with the Lakers because of representing Ron Artest. And David wanted him to go with the Lakers, and I really questioned it, because they had taken Derek Character with that, one of the
Yeah.
last picks in the second round. And Derek and Samardo were very similar. And so we also had the other team that we liked, that I liked, was the Chicago Bulls. And I was dealing with their assistant GM, Matt Lloyd, who's now with the Timberwolves. And they loved him. I mean, they're on him the entire pre-draft. And they had, it was an interesting time. It was when they had Derrick Rose, but then they had like a ton of free agents, and it was when LeBron was a free agent, and it was
Yeah.
right before LeBron and Bosh went to Miami. But I thought Chicago was going to get them, but either way, I knew they're going to spend their money on big free agents and have a lot of minimum spots. And so I just saw it as a great opportunity for him to earn a spot and some guaranteed money. So David put me on the spot. He said, You put your job on the line for this?" And I was like, "Come on, man." He was half joking, but I did put my neck on the line to a certain extent of like, hey, Dave, I really think we should have him go to Chicago. And
Yep.
so we did it. Samaro trusted us, went to Summer League with Chicago. He started for them. He did great. He did not sign with the Bulls though. He got a 3-year contract with the Cleveland Cavaliers because of his performance at Summer League. So that exposure, benefited differently than we thought it would. But it all worked out. He ended up getting a better deal than most of the second round. It was really a very rewarding deal for me just because, I was so young and I really kind of put a lot of work in, rolled up my sleeves with David, and really thankful that David, trusted me to do some of that pretty high level work. It really helped me, moving forward, develop into becoming a pretty effective agent.
Absolutely. Now, in that, agency role for you, and, I know you mentioned represent, Ron Artest and different players. So a guy says, you know what, Matt, I'm not overly, thrilled on the role I've got right now with the Cavs. Would you mind putting some feelers out there to see if there's any interest, or how does that kind of work in the chain of command from the player versus like the GM, reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, we're looking at shopping your guy," because from the outside perspective, we hear all the, "Yeah, I showed up one day and my locker said, yeah, you're."
Right.
You're not a part of the team anymore. But what does that kind of look like behind the curtains?
I think a lot of times it's case by case. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it is, I think different agents operate completely different. I mean, you've got the guys that are your stereotypical sharks, right? Where you can't trust them at all, and they're doing all kinds of sneaky stuff. My approach was more, sort of respecting the game, if you will. I kind of took approach more as being a basketball person and an advisor, than your stereotypical lawyer type agent,
Yep.
and I think, in hindsight, I probably, if I were to ever go back to the agency business, which is very doubtful, I would probably bring on a partner that is a lawyer to kind of take on that more traditional agent hat and maybe more of like the basketball advisor. But yeah, so for me, I really prioritized, my relationships with the NBA front office. I'd spent a lot of time visiting my clients, early and often, just to make sure that the communication was strong with the team. So when things popped up, this wasn't like a cold call, being like, "Why is my player not playing?" or whatever. It was more fluid communication and sort of mutual respect that had been established already.
Yeah. Now, I think a second thing that can be difficult, once again, outside perspective, so I'm more asking this is, from the agent standpoint to the player standpoint, I think what happens frequently for players across different leagues is they feel like, man, getting here was the rocket, the mountaintop moment. It's like, well, no, now you're here. Now we need you to work even harder to, earn a stay, a long time contract, not just, hey, you made it to the NBA, but after this rookie contract expires, you're overseas. So talk a bit about that, relationship with the player, and I would say maybe even like the vetting process to make sure they were a good fit with you and you were going to be a good fit with them and what you're going to ask them to do or maybe help them understand what they need to do.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've had so many different angles into the agency business, and a lot of it, really depended on where I was at, and the strategies changed from company to company.
Yeah.
By the time I really kind of stepped in my own and was running my own business, I really kind of put together a strategy of getting more fringe type of guys and doing higher volume business.
Yeah.
And a big reason for that is one, I started on my own very young. I mean, I became a primary agent while I was still in my 20s,
Yeah.
and I really wanted to. Actually, I think about my uncle Rob. He'd say, to be effective at your job, you need to do all the jobs under that title to lead properly and understand how it all works. And I really took that to heart. And he'd never been an agent, but I took that approach to the agency business of like, okay, a big part, if I'm going to do high volume business and I'm going to get these, second round picks where it's a little cleaner business, not as risky from an investment standpoint as far as like the pre-draft expenses and naturally, a lot of times with just the bribery, the illegal business that goes with part of that too, I could kind of, be competitive, kind of stick to my moral compass, But to do that effectively, I need to be able to understand how international basketball works well. And so
Yeah.
I spent those first few years when I was on my own, strategically getting a lot of guys that I thought I could market overseas to one, establish a presence so I could, get a good collection of collaborations with international agents, understand how the different leagues worked. Yeah, I mean, I think at one point with some other agents, it represented nearly like 100 guys
Wow.
overseas. And then I was picking and choosing my spots with NBA guys, but I was targeting more of the lower risk, second round picks, French guys. And the reason for saying all this is that what ended up happening is I worked with a lot of guys that took the underdog approach. And so this was very different type recruitment than it would have been, when I was with the bigger agencies trying to get first round picks. It's a totally different process. And I really just kind of sold, hey, I am what I say I am. I'm an honest, hardworking guy. I'm well connected. I understand how all of this works. And so if you're wanting a big agency and the glitz and the glam of it, it's not me, right? It's like I'm a basketball guy that's just an honest, hardworking guy. And so I get these guys that kind of took that blue collar approach and it's sort of the more of a partnership type arrangement between player and agent rather than the fast talking wheeler dealer agent and star player relationship. And so I really and I did really appreciate that part of it because you put together a collaborative plan and when things worked, it was very rewarding. I mean, it was you and your guy, and like he did his part, you did your part, and now you're reaping the benefits. And I represent a lot of guys. It wasn't always like that. I mean, sometimes it was a little bit more formal business, but some of these guys are still some of my best friends.
Absolutely. Now, I know you said, hey, I was kind of strategic in the, fringe players. Now, were any of those guys disappointed? Hey, I had that dream of playing in the NBA and now I'm looking to go overseas and my goal is to be in the NBA, and you kind of talk them through, well, here's the deal. You can try the NBA route, but over here you're gonna get a great paycheck or these different things and kind of really help them see the opportunity at hand and based on your experience and your knowledge of the industry.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in most cases, the processes have changed quite a bit with just the landscape of the G League and all that. But yeah, back then, I mean, it was a lot of times a big hurdle to get over of convincing the guys to go start their international careers because I mean, it is a stepping stone process in most cases over there where I mean. Europe specifically, I mean, they're very careful on, bringing in a young American. Like, can they handle the culture shock? Are they mature
Right.
enough? And a lot of times guys aren't, even if they are
Yeah.
really talented. And so like I think guys need to get over there, and a lot of times take a pretty reasonable deal in terms of the financial compensation, and just build up their credibility and back then playing the G League, I was just not a big fan of it because it was just no money in
Right.
the odds were really stacked against the guys of finding success, in the NBA through the G League, even though there were some stories the probability of telling me this is better to just go overseas and then pursue NBA opportunities through summer league and whatnot. And so yeah, that was a big part of identifying players, like the initial talks with them, with the player, their parents, their coaches, of hey, what are your expectations for yourself and your
Right.
career? And it's like, I mean, I see some different pathways, and depending on the player, it all would change. But like, here's our pathways to success. Are you on board? Because if you're not, like, I don't want to waste my time and money,
Right. Yeah.
and so like we'd back off guys, if it wasn't the right fit, and you get some guys that would look at agents as they're just a bank, too. I mean, a lot of those recruiting meetings, to me, the way I looked at it is like, it need to be mutually beneficial. I'm not just trying to sign good players. I'm trying to sign good players that we can make some money with,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's like any business, or I mean, think of it like real estate. It's like, hey, this might be a nice house, but like, how much are you paying for it?
That's right.
It'll change your perspective,
Yep.
very quickly.
I love it. So, as you mentioned, you've gone through the agency route, you've worked at the large places, you started your own, you represented your own clients, and eventually decide I don't think this is the route I want to be in long term and make a pivot. So talk a little bit about, what came, or I guess what was maybe the ending spot of that and then the beginning of the new launching pad.
Yeah, it was a gradual progress. I mean, it was like a few years, and every year, I started to get more and more negative about the industry. I mean, I was having to manage a lot, and a lot of it was I wasn't. And maybe this was an immaturity thing. I wasn't comfortable with delegating a whole lot, and so I tried
Yeah.
to do everything myself. And so then um, I take on all the stress of my players, and so I was representing so many guys. I was the point person on all of it. And at the time I didn't have kids, and now I have kids, and it's kind of like, the saying of you're only as happy as your least happy child, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of like what it was like as an agent, especially if you're taking that role where you're in the driver's seat on it all.
Right.
And so yeah, I think a few years before I even got out, I had committed to taking a scouting job with the Sacramento Kings. And yeah, what had happened was the GM at the time was Vlade Divac,
Mhm.
and the assistant GM was a good friend of our Mike Bratz. And Vlade told Mike, "Hey, you hire one of your guys, and I'm gonna hire Bobby Jackson." So he hired Bobby Jackson. Mike says, "All right, you're my guy. We're good to go. We'll do the paperwork in 2 or 3 weeks after like vacation time." He calls me in a few weeks. He's like, man, I got bad news. We're not hiring you, and I think I'm getting fired." And so I'm like, all right, man. Well, I guess I gotta be an agent again. And so then I had a couple years knowing that I wanted to get out, but it was a weird spot to be in because like I couldn't like fully pursue other jobs while running an agency. It's just
Right.
not a simple business of just like stepping out when you have all these clients. And then
Yep.
I was juggling, again, kind of battling sort of like the ethical part of it of like, do I aggressively recruit all these kids knowing I don't even want to do this anymore? And it was
Yeah.
just I had like 2, 3 years where it was really a struggle. And so I was kind of pursuing things, but I was kind of building my business, but I was kind of one foot in, one foot out. And then it just got to a point where I talked to my wife. I was like, you know what, I don't think this is going to be an easy business to get out of. And it's like I don't feel right like not being 110% on something. I think I need to pull the plug. And I dealt with some of my partners. I had co-owned an agent side, American-based agency, Babcock Sports, and then agency in Asia, Babcock Sports Asia. And I was able to cash out a little bit, not where it was like, hey, I'm making big money, I'm looking at retirement, but like enough to where I can kind of make a crazy career move in my 30s, and
Yeah.
I got my wife on board, and just got out and help all my players find new agents, and um, didn't really have a very detailed plan as far as what to do next. All I knew is I wanted to scout, and
Yeah.
so I was pursuing some NBA jobs. Had a couple things I thought were gonna click that fell through, and I started volunteer scouting for Marty Blake and Associates. So Marty Blake, legend of an NBA scout, he was general manager back in the '70s and stuff like that. And, started a scouting service for the NBA, Marty Blake and Associates. And he was a great friend of my dad and my uncles, and he had passed away a while ago. But his son Ryan took over the business a while back, and he became a great friend of ours. And yeah, let me volunteer scout for him. So I'd do my own schedule. Ryan would give me credentials, and I'd send him reports, and sort of we'd compare notes. I'd help him with the Portsmouth Invitational selections and all that. And yeah, I was scouting for free, trying to figure out what my next steps were. And then, yeah, a really, big break. Sports Illustrated reached out to me, wanted me to write a series of stories about the NBA draft from an agent's perspective.
Yeah.
And so I just had this like year where I kind of got a lot of exposure to the scouting world and media, and really started to learn the power of media, and it just kind of took me on an entirely different path. Again, I mean, the agency business wasn't planned for me, and now I'm a scout in the media, and it's yeah, it was another interesting chapter for sure.
I love it. So, in the world of scouting, I think today there's more accessibility to knowledge and players than probably ever before. And at the same token, there's still an art of really being able to, scout and understand a player. And, in this environment, they're going to thrive, but in this environment, they could be a bottom feeder, I mean, just really understanding how they fit into a full situation. So talk a little bit about, that from your standpoint and getting into, the scouting and analysis world and, giving your honest feedback on the players.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, it's something that I felt. day one scouting, I felt more comfortable than I ever did as an agent.
Mm,
The agency business, even though I got to a certain point where I was, relatively effective and had success, I always felt like I was forcing it. I didn't really feel that comfortable in my own skin. I wasn't really proud to be a sports agent. And so when I first started scouting, I mean, there was so much uncertainty of like what I was going to do with it from a business standpoint of like, okay, how do I find success here? But as far as the responsibilities and getting in my car and going to the games and hop on flights and stuff, it felt natural. I mean, I felt like I'd had like a 30 something year internship following my dad and uncles around, right? And so I was very, very well prepared in my mind to get going on it. And, over time, I think, I've been doing that now for what, 8, 9 years. Um, and keep in mind that the game was evolving rapidly, and
absolutely.
it still is. And I think within 8 years, it's changed so much, which has naturally changed how we're scouting. And so, I mean, I was really having to, learn and adapt, on the fly, and a lot, some trial and error. After that first year, I started Babcock Hoops, and what had happened was that, I mentioned, got this exposure to the scouting service, the media credentials, sort of the unique access that I was able to gain, more so than my dad and my uncles and NBA personnel, and figure out, okay, how can I leverage this to kind of create a unique perspective of this scouting game. And at first, it was really just intended to be a launching pad to get a job with an NBA team.
Yeah.
And I had several friends that were, NBA scouts that were in between jobs. There's so much turnover in that business. And I sort of recruited them to put together this, mini staff to where we operated like an NBA front office, covering the draft and just creating content along the way. What had happened was we had some success, and I sort of, carved out this new identity as an NBA draft analyst, and started getting interviewed on different podcasts. And yeah, just one thing led to another. And during that time, I mean, I mentioned, there was so much uncertainty of like, okay, how am I going to properly monetize this
Yeah.
business of scouting? If it needs to be, I need to get a job with a team, or what do I do? And so what had happened was I got some media deals separate from Babcock Hoops, and then I had a lot of people hitting me up wanting help with all different kinds of stuff within basketball, just with my well-rounded experience. And it got to a point where I was like, you know what? I need to start charging these people. Like, I can't just be friendly to everybody. Like, I'm like bleeding money right now.
Yeah.
And and so yeah, I kind of carved out this niche of doing, sort of like a gigs type consulting business where, some of it was media deals, some of it was just your traditional consulting for agencies, for teams, scouting service type stuff. And so yeah, the last, almost decade now, I mean, I've really had sort of like a revolving door of just gigs. Some of them are like project based, some of them are, a little bit more long term. But the one thing I've kept constant is in my role as an NBA draft analyst and scout. And yeah, no, it's been great. It's been, another, like I said, another very unique chapter, so unorthodox. Didn't really plan, any of it. It just kind of, took it day by day, but worked hard and just, remained passionate about basketball, about my knowledge of basketball, and open-minded about how to help people and how to monetize it properly.
Yeah. So, in the draft analyst side of things, I mean, it's such an intriguing world, right? You can have a guy that seemingly Steph Curry, plays at a small school, doesn't really have the physical attributes you would look for in somebody, but maybe has this element of intangible work ethic that it's like he's just going to figure it out, right? And then you get the guy that seemingly, is a no-brainer, absolute great pick and gets injured or gets to the team and doesn't work hard anymore. And it's like, man, these are the parts that make the job so difficult, right? If it was just what meets the eye test and that was all that mattered, well, your job would be able to be done by many people. But there's, so many levels to it. So talk a little bit about all the different things that you're evaluating as you're really analyzing players and, the opportunity that they have for success in, the NBA.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, and you're absolutely right. There are so many different variables to juggle, with determining who's a valuable prospect and at what level, right? And I think I've heard a number of people that are negative about our space, whether it be an NBA draft analysts or scouting in front offices and whatnot, that hey, they're just rolling the dice. And the thing about my take on that is yes, that is true to a certain extent, but
Yep.
what our job is to increase the probability as much as possible, right? And so there's so
Absolutely.
many variables that teams can't control, and there's so many things that have to happen right. As far as how is this young kid going to handle a bunch of money coming at him?
Yeah.
Is it going to, some guys react positively, others react dramatically negatively, right? And so I mean, I think finding indicators on all the little things, okay, are one, identifying, okay, who's got the physical tools and the talent and the upside, of your basic eye test type stuff. And once you kind of check that box, now it's all the little stuff. It's the indicators. Okay, what is going to stop this kid from reaching his potential? And obviously there's things that happen like injuries, like you mentioned, stuff like that. But it's really, just trying to figure out who's the best bet.
Yeah. So as we look at that and you're analyzing the player, I think the other element is then the program or the team that they end up with.
Right.
And when you're looking at that, are you purely trying to just analyze player by player, or are you kind of looking, all right, with this draft order, this player would be a more ideal fit here and giving that feedback? Because, I think of so many times, players wind up in a situation where in a different team or in a different role, they probably have a lot more success. But unfortunately, they went into this situation and, maybe
Sure.
what the team needed from them wasn't their best, attribute. And all of a sudden, 3 years later, they're out. And it's like, well, they probably weren't that bad of a player to, 3 years later, go from a top 10 draft pick to 3 years out of the league. But due to the situation, maybe not meshing well with their skill or their talent level and what was needed there, that ends up being the outcome.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I've kind of looked at it from different perspectives too. Obviously, as an agent, I certainly did when I'm advising players, like, okay, there needs to be a pathway for success here.
Yeah.
And if there's a log jam at a certain position and these guys are under contract for multiple years in front of you, I don't know if this makes sense for us or the team. Like, why would the team even consider you, you know?
Yeah.
And so like when I'm doing our scouting throughout the season, I start off with a big board, which is essentially just rankings, and it's a balance of my personal opinion and just sort of projection of where I see their market value being or where I think it will be at draft time. And then in the spring, I'll release a mock draft. I don't do it right now, even though it is really good for clickbait.
Yeah. Right.
But it's hard to do accurately because I mean the order changes so much. It just feels kind of sloppy to me. But in the spring, when we get closer to knowing how the order is going to be, then I start putting myself in the chair of each team's general manager. Okay, I'm looking at their salary structures. I'm
Yeah.
looking at the age of their players. What the perceptive game plan might be as far as, are we win now? Are we development mode? And then I figure out what are their best options, and then I make the picks as if I'm their general manager, kind of utilizing all of the variables that I think would be in place. And keep in mind, I've always since I was a little kid, I always thought I was gonna be a general manager, and so I really enjoy that part of it because it's just it doesn't feel like a homework type task to me. It's something I'm passionate about, and so yeah, throughout the year I just do as much to soak up as much knowledge about these players, while kind of taking a peripheral view on the teams, so I know I could kind of connect the dots properly.
I love it. Now, in today's landscape, I would imagine there's probably two different elements that I think would be more difficult today than maybe was previously. One is the amount of international players and, United States-based players where it's almost getting to be like 50-50 on the draft picks. So, I mean, so many more talents that you have to evaluate to give that, overall decision. And then the second part is how much earlier players are entering in. I mean, so many players after one season are going in. You don't have a whole lot of body of work, to evaluate someone. Whereas maybe, JJ Redick, it's like, all right, well, here's how he
Sure.
progressed over time. You're not going to have to worry about this element anymore. He worked through that between his freshman and his junior year, and now, here's a more clean product. So, how much more difficult does it make it, one, in having the international and U.S. landscape, but then also the youth versus, having guys that are, 2, 3, 4 year players where you've seen a little bit of the evolution and growth instead of, hey, I'm basing this off of potential.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's definitely a very challenging part of it. One thing I do to sort of alleviate some of that pressure of having that small sample size when these guys are in college is I scout high school aggressively. I mean,
Yeah.
I go really hard, and the more experience I've gained, the more I value that process. And
Yeah.
so I start watching the top guys when they're 14, 15 years old and track them, throughout their high school careers. And the evaluation in most cases is a lot different than it is when I'm going to watch a guy that's a freshman in college that's likely going to be in the draft. It's more of I go and just kind of get a lay of the land, kind of get a basis, to kind of understand who the player is, sort of his tendencies, his personalities, body type. It's we're so far from needing to do a comprehensive evaluation. It's more of a starting point, to figure out, okay, once I do start watching them in their projected draft year, I'm not starting from scratch. I'm like, hey, who is this kid? Where's he from? What are some of the concern or potential concerns? And so you try and get as major head start on guys, and similar with the international kids. And one thing that can be really tricky with international is a lot of times these guys will play for big clubs and not play much, and it's
Right.
just it's impossible to evaluate guys without some exposure. I mean, and that's when it's great. I love it when guys play for smaller teams or like the junior teams because I don't have a problem myself evaluating guys even if they're playing against lesser competition, but I do need to see them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like some people have asked me about like going to like overtime elite. Do I have a hard time evaluating there? And I don't. I think it's great. I mean, it's competitive enough to where I can figure out if a guy can play or not, but he's got to be on the court. He's got to be playing.
Yeah. Well, and I think even to that point, sometimes internationally, if a guy scores 13 points a game, he might be a really good talent overseas, right? And in the US, just the way our basketball style is,
Sure.
you say, man, if you're only averaging 13, you're gonna have a real tough time being able to translate. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that you have to really understand the game and to your point, be able to see him actually in action.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like to that point, I think that's a big issue right now with college. And one thing is the college game and the NBA game are so different. I mean, it's like a different sport. And so, the translatability of players, it's not seamless all the time. I mean, the NBA is very much versatility and switchable. I mean, they want 6'6", 6'8" guys that can do a little bit of everything. And so, like your big bodied guys with slow feet that are dominating college basketball, or a small dynamic point guard, those guys aren't usually as valuable, at the NBA level as they are in college.
Yeah, which you saw that with Zach Edey this last a couple of years, right? I mean,
Mhm.
arguably the most dominant college player, and even after doing that back-to-back years, still doesn't go, until
Right.
mid first round, and it's like, yeah, that's just part of the difference in the game.
Sure. Absolutely.
Oh, I love it. Well, Matt, I just want to say thanks so much for hopping on, sharing your journey and all the amazing things you're doing, and excited to continue to watch you and the business grow. And I'm an NBA draft junkie, so one of these times I might have to zoom in and watch it with you and get your analysis as it goes through.
No, it sounds great. And thanks a lot. I really appreciate this.